Okay, so you've probably seen the headlines today, April 10th. A real mix, right? Trade stuff, budget arguments, a new voting law proposal, updates on that Idaho case, and even some pretty wild weather forecasts.
Yeah, seems like totally separate things going on.
Exactly. But for this deep dive, we want to kind of peel back the layers and see if there are hidden connections, maybe some unexpected ways these things link up and, what it all might actually mean for you.
Right, looking for that connecting thread. And I think a big part of it today is the element of the unexpected and how that can ripple outwards.
Okay, good place to start. Let's jump into trade then. The U.S. tariff situation seemed to change on a dime. 1 minute, most new tariffs are paused. Someone even called it yippee. Apparently then boom, less than 24 hours later.
The tariffs specifically on China shoot way up to 125%. That was after China hit back with an 84% levy of their own.
So what's the immediate fallout? We saw global stocks jump, which, okay, sounds positive maybe.
Well, yes and no. Good for investors, maybe, in the short term. But for you, the listener, this could directly mean higher prices. We're talking toys, car parts, lots of retail goods.
And potentially shortages later on.
Yeah.
Like around the holidays.
It's definitely a risk. China, meanwhile, they called it blackmail, but they also said they're still open to talks. Although you do hear some commentary about a possible economic divorce down the line.
It's fascinating how quickly that's shifted. You mentioned the initial pause was linked to bond market concerns.
That was the reported reason, yeah. Bond market jitters, maybe worries about economic stability, but then they pivoted hard on China anyway. It suggests a very, very targeted approach there, even with those broader concerns sort of hanging in the air.
Okay, and speaking of instability, or at least disagreement, let's look at the U.S. budget. The House Republicans actually canceled a budget vote.
Yeah, couldn't get their own members on the same page.
Yeah.
You've got this pretty significant division. Hardliners are demanding really deep cuts, like $1.5 to $2 trillion.
Wow, compared to what?
Compared to the Senate's proposal, which is, I think, around $4 billion, so a huge gap. Makes Speaker Johnson's job, well, incredibly difficult.
And there's connection back to the tariffs here too, right? Something procedural.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected things are in D.C. The specific rule they use, or tried to use, to block votes that disapproved of Trump's tariffs, that was tied into the budget process.
Huh. So a fight over the budget spills over and affects how they handle trade policy votes.
It really highlights the, let's say, the procedural tangles and how one issue can unexpectedly sideswipe another.
All right, let's shift again the SAVE Act. This is about voter registration.
That's right. The main points are mandatory in-person voter registration and requiring specific proof of citizenship like a birth certificate or a passport.
And the argument for it is election security.
Primarily, yes. Supporters say it's needed to secure the process.
But there's pushback.
Oh, definitely. Opponents, mostly Democrats, raise serious concerns about disenfranchisement. They worry it could make it much harder for certain groups to register. Think about military personnel deployed overseas, or maybe women who've recently married and changed their names.
So it becomes this balancing act question. Security versus access.
Precisely. How do you ensure security without putting up barriers that might prevent eligible citizens from participating? It's a tough one.
Okay, let's turn to the Idaho murders case, the pretrial hearings for Brian Kohberger. The defense is trying to get evidence tossed out.
Yeah, quite a bit, actually. Things like text messages between the surviving roommates, the 911 call itself, some alleged Amazon purchases a mask, a knife, even a selfie found on his phone, and that description mentioning bushy eyebrows.
And the judge, what's being allowed or disallowed?
Well, the judge has ruled on a few things. For instance, the prosecution can't use labels like psychopath or bring up an autism diagnosis just to argue for a harsher punishment. But interestingly, the judge is allowing the defense to introduce theories about alternative suspects.
And the prosecution plans to call family members.
That's their stated intention, yes. Calling members of Kohberger's own family to testify. It just shows how complex and, frankly, unpredictable these legal steps can be leading up to a trial.
Right, one last area, the weather. It's pretty starkly different across the U.S. right now.
It really is. You've got the East Coast dealing with rain, potential snow, even flooding risks in some areas.
All down south.
Big contrast. Severe storm threat in the Tennessee Valley. We're talking damaging winds, hail, maybe even tornadoes. That's affecting like 14 million people.
And then out west.
Record heat building in the Southwest. Phoenix is getting close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit already.
Wow. So heavy rain, severe storms, and record heat all at once.
Yeah, it's another example, isn't it? These powerful, sometimes unexpected forces impacting daily life very differently depending on where you are.
So pulling it all together then, today's news, it's not just, random items. There's this undercurrent of sudden shifts, underlying tensions, whether it's trade policy flipping overnight, budget fights, freezing action, legal arguments shaping a trial, or even just the atmosphere itself.
Absolutely. And the key thing for you, the listener, is that each of these seemingly separate events has the potential to ripple out. It could affect your wallet, your rights, maybe even just your daily routine in ways you might not immediately connect.
Right. So maybe the takeaway thought is this. How could a trade argument happening, halfway across the world, or some procedural vote in Congress eventually change the price tag on your groceries? Or impact how easy it is to vote next time?
What are those less obvious connections playing out in the news you consume every single day worth thinking about from your own perspective?